Snow fell like punishment. Not a gentle drift or soft hush, but sharp, needling flakes that stung exposed skin and blurred the horizon in white. The wind howled across the open plains, sweeping through the naked cottonwoods and snapping at the thick wool coat of the rider on the ridge. James kept riding. His black gelding, heavy with sweat despite the cold, stepped carefully through the frozen ruts in the earth. Rain had fallen earlier, then froze, then snowed. The ground beneath them was treacherous, but James didn't slow. He never did. Not for weather. Not for memory. The ache in his right knee had returned, the same one that warned of storms and long winters. He adjusted in the saddle, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the horizon. To most, it looked like an endless, empty expanse of snow and pine. But James knew every fold in the hills, every break in the trees. The land had raised him. It had also broken him. He didn't expect to see anything unusual. But then, just past the bend in the gulch where a dying fence post leaned into nothing, he saw movement. Not the kind of movement that belonged to deer or cattle. Something too still. Too wrong. He stopped the horse. 3 figures. Tied to the broken fence with hemp rope and their own scarves. Huddled like discarded laundry in the snow, their dresses soaked through, hair matted with ice. One lifted her head sluggishly, another didn't move at all. The third sat up slowly as if by force of will alone. James cursed under his breath. This was not his business. Not his land. And certainly not his problem. He dismounted anyway. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, clinging to his hat, weighing down his shoulders. The wind kicked up from the west, carrying the smell of ash and something bitter. He stepped closer. The women didn't speak. Their eyes were red-rimmed, skin pale and raw with cold. He recognized them vaguely from town, a homestead 2 valleys over. The man they'd all married had died months ago. 3 wives. No children. No rights. He crouched before the one in the middle. Her lips were cracked, bleeding slightly at the corners. Her face was round once, probably kind too, before it was drained of color. What happened? The one on the end coughed. They left us, she rasped. Who? Our husband's kin, she said, eyes hollow. Said we were a burden. Said he was the only tie we had to the land. They said, we were nothing. The wind ripped the rest of her sentence away. James looked at the rope, frayed, poorly tied, already crusted with ice. Whoever had done this, they hadn't cared if the women survived the night. He hesitated. He didn't want this. Not the anger that stirred in his gut. Not the sharp sting of pity, or worse, empathy. He'd buried his emotions with his wife and child, 7 winters ago. There was no room in his life now for anyone else's ghosts. But the third woman. She hadn't spoken. Hadn't moved much. She looked at him, though. Straight through him. Her eyes weren't pleading. They weren't even afraid. They were tired. Resigned. But behind the stillness, he saw something else. A stubborn thread of fire that refused to die out. It startled him. Without a word, James drew his knife and cut the rope. One by one. The women fell forward, groaning as blood returned to limbs gone numb. He caught the quiet one, just barely, as she collapsed into the snow. She was lighter than he expected. Bones and wet cloth. You ride? He asked. None of them answered. They could barely stand. He whistled sharply, and his horse came close. He lifted the silent woman first, sliding her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. She didn't protest. Her body sagged against him, heavy with cold and exhaustion. The other 2 staggered behind on foot as he turned toward the trail that led home. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. The cabin was 2 miles out. A narrow stretch through pine and ice and uneven terrain. He'd have to go slow. Night was falling. Wolves sometimes moved this way when storms rolled in. And still, he led them. Rain began to fall through the snow. Cold, heavy drops that soaked through coats and fur and skin. No one spoke. The sound of the horse's hooves, the wheezing breath of the women behind, and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of ice were the only sounds that filled the woods. The woman in his arms trembled faintly. He adjusted the edge of his coat around her shoulders. He didn't know her name. Didn't ask. He wasn't ready for names. By the time they reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving. The place wasn't much, log walls, a lean-to barn, a single lamp glowing in the main room, but it was shelter. And tonight, it would have to be enough. He helped the silent woman down, catching her again when her legs buckled. She didn't meet his eyes this time. Just leaned on him until he got the door open. Inside, the heat hit them like a fist, thick and dry. The coals glowed in the hearth. He stoked them quickly, tossing on more wood. The women moved like ghosts, unsure whether they belonged. Take the cots, he said flatly. Dry yourselves. I'll fetch water. One of them, older, with a twisted expression that was more fear than anger, nodded. The other dropped onto the cot without a word. James turned, fetched a bucket from outside, and filled the kettle over the fire. As the water heated, he ladled out broth from the pot he'd left simmering that morning. It wasn't much: beans, root vegetables, some smoked elk, but it would help. They didn't thank him. He didn't expect them to. The women sipped slowly, cradling tin cups with shaking hands. The quiet one, her face now lit by firelight, was younger than he'd thought. Her cheeks were hollow, lips pale, but her eyes, they hadn't lost that defiant glow. He met them once more, then looked away. James poured himself a drink of whiskey, went outside, and sat on the porch in the cold. Rain mixed with snow. The wind still moaned across the ridge. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the storm, or the look in her eyes. He hadn't saved them for redemption. He hadn't done it to feel good. There was no glory in dragging broken people through ice and mud and putting them in a cabin that still smelled of old grief. He'd done it because no one else would. But even as the wind bit through his coat, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at him. Not with hope, but with recognition. Like she knew what it meant to be abandoned by blood. Like she'd seen the cold before, and decided to live anyway. He drained the glass and stared into the dark. Behind him, 3 strangers slept under his roof. 3 women no one wanted. And one, who might just thaw something he thought was long dead. James didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in 7 years, he didn't dread it. Not entirely. Dawn crept in slow and silver. The storm had quieted but left behind its wreckage, branches strewn like bones across the ground, fences drooping beneath the weight of ice, and a sky bruised with low-hanging clouds. The snow was no longer falling, but the earth remained wet, the air swollen with cold. Inside the cabin, silence pressed against the walls. James stirred before the others. Habit. His body moved stiffly, but it obeyed, driven by old rhythms and the need to control what little could be controlled. He didn't glance at the cots, though he knew they were still occupied. He stepped outside, breathing the sharp air, boots crunching over the crusted snow. Smoke puffed steadily from the chimney. Behind the cabin, the barn loomed, its roof slightly caved on one corner, thanks to last winter's heavy fall. He'd meant to fix it. Like everything else, it waited for a day that never came. When he returned, the women were awake. The oldest sat near the fire, wrapping bandages tight around her ankles. The second sat hunched over a tin mug, her eyes flickering toward him, then away. The youngest, the quiet one, Alma, though he'd still not heard her name spoken aloud, stood by the window, staring out at the barren fields. None of them said a word. James dropped the satchel of dried cornmeal and beans on the table, filled the kettle, and set it over the flame. The walls ticked and groaned as the heat spread. "You stayin' long?" he asked flatly, directing the question at no one. No answer came. He hadn't expected one. Later that morning, James set about repairing the eastern fence line. Snowmelt made the ground soft, the tools slippery in his grasp. Every now and then, he glanced back toward the cabin. A single curl of smoke still rose, steady and thin. By midday, one of the women, the nervous one, appeared near the barn, trying to carry a feed sack twice her size. She nearly dropped it before he stepped in. She flinched when he approached. He took the sack, wordless, and placed it down. "You don't have to help," he said, not unkindly. Her voice was a whisper. "I don't want to feel useless." She left before he could reply. Inside the barn, he found Alma. She was brushing down his mare, gentle but thorough, her hands moving with quiet purpose. She didn't look up when he entered. The horse stood calm beneath her touch, content in a way it rarely was even for him. "You worked stables before?" he asked. A pause. Then a nod. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "You speak at all?" he asked. Alma paused. Her hand stilled against the mare's flank. She turned her head just enough to let him see her profile. Only when words help. Her voice was low and even. Steady. That night, James ate alone on the porch. The others kept to themselves indoors. He watched the clouds gather again, darker this time. Rain was coming. Maybe sleet. Maybe worse. He sipped from his flask and remembered a time when the porch was full of laughter. When warm arms wrapped around his shoulders. When the sound of a lullaby hummed inside these walls. Now, only the creak of wood and the wind through empty pines remained. Inside, Alma mended a torn blanket with thread she'd found in the pantry. The other 2 wives spoke in whispers, about food, about boots, about whether they'd be sent away soon. "He doesn't want us here," one said. "He didn't have to bring us here," the other replied. Alma said nothing. That night, a knock came at the door. James stood from the table, hand resting instinctively near the rifle by the coat rack. When he opened the door, rain gusted in, thin and slanted. A figure stood under the eaves. Tall. Cloaked in deerskin. Face shadowed by the brim of a sodden hat. James stepped aside. Didn't expect you this far down the ridge. The man stepped in, peeled off his coat, and set it neatly on a chair. His hair, dark and streaked with gray, hung in damp ropes past his jaw. He was broad, silent, and moved with the slow assurance of someone who had never needed to rush to survive. The women stiffened. James poured a mug and handed it over. "Red Hawk," he said, not introducing him further. Red Hawk nodded toward the women but said nothing. He sat by the fire, warming his hands. James leaned against the wall. "Trouble?" Red Hawk nodded once. "Riders. 3. Traced M halfway down the pass. Not locals. Moved quiet. Watched your cabin for a while. Then circled off." James's jaw worked. "Looking for someone?" Red Hawk shrugged. "Looking for something. He left before dawn, disappearing into the woods like smoke." James didn't wake the women. But he felt the shift. Something had cracked open, beneath the quiet, beyond the storm. He found himself watching the edges of the tree line more often. Listening for sounds that didn't belong. The next day, he rode out to check the traps on the northern ridge. Found one sprung with nothing inside. Another missing entirely. He crouched near the fresh snow and found boot prints, too small to be his, too clean to be accidental. When he returned, Alma was by the creek with a pail. Alone. "You see anyone out here?" he asked, approaching her slowly. She didn't flinch. "No. You wander much?" "I walk," she said. "It clears the noise." James studied her. Her sleeves were rolled, her fingers red from the cold water. She worked with the quiet certainty of someone who had always carried more than her share. "You ever think about leavin'?" he asked. She turned toward him then, properly, her gaze steady. "I never stopped thinking about it. I just don't have anywhere left to go." He had no answer. That evening, he saw her in the barn again. One of the younger horses had tangled its leg in a strap and lay whimpering on its side. Alma knelt beside it, murmuring softly as she untangled the mess. James stood in the shadows, unseen, watching her speak in a language without words, just touch and breath and patience. The foal settled. She stayed with it long after he left. Days passed. The older wife began to cook meals again, quietly and without asking. The nervous one organized the shelves in the pantry, mumbling to herself as she worked. Alma cleaned out the barn, fixed a broken hinge, and stitched a pair of James's old gloves without being told. Still, James kept his distance. Until one morning, when he stepped outside to find his saddle half buried in snow. He cursed, yanked it up, and found his bridle missing. The fence gate swung loose. One of the horses was gone. He followed the tracks into the woods, angry, alert, and didn't return for hours. When he did, he brought back the mare, spooked but unharmed, and a piece of blue fabric tied to the fence just beyond his property. His hands shook when he removed it. He tossed it into the fire without a word. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did Alma. She sat beside the hearth, staring into the flames, her hands curled tightly in her lap. The glow caught the edge of her cheekbone, the quiet line of her jaw. James poured a drink. Paused. Then set the glass down. He stood near her, uncertain. "I know what silence costs," he said finally. She looked up, surprised by the sound of his voice. He didn't sit beside her, but he didn't walk away either. "I didn't bring you here for charity. I didn't want to bring you at all." Alma waited. "But you remind me of someone. Not in how you look. Not in how you speak. Just in the way you survive." A long pause settled between them. Alma's voice was quiet. "That's the only way some of us get to live." James nodded. For once, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt shared. And outside, the wind changed direction. The trees whispered a warning neither of them could yet hear. The scarf came back with the wind. James found it just past first light, tied in a careful knot around the same broken fence post where he had first found the women. The wind lifted its corner like a beckoning hand. Blue cotton, frayed at the edges. The same fabric that had burned in his fire, or so he thought. He didn't move for a long time. The snow around the post had been disturbed by boots. 3 pairs. Maybe 4. Recent, from the way the frost hadn't settled over them yet. Someone had been here, close enough to watch the cabin, bold enough to leave a message. James untied the scarf and stuffed it into his coat pocket. His horse shifted nervously behind him, sensing something that had yet to show its face. By the time he returned to the cabin, Alma was already outside, splitting kindling with clean, steady strokes. She barely looked up as he passed. He didn't tell her what he found. Not yet. Inside, the air was warm but tense. The other 2 women had grown quieter over the past week, and their eyes moved more often toward the windows. Even the sound of crows made them flinch now. That evening, James saddled up and rode to the far edge of his property, where the trees thickened and the sky darkened early. He met Red Hawk by a shallow rise, where frost clung to the rocks like mold. They've been watchin' from the north, Red Hawk said without greeting. Passed their tracks 3 times now. Men on foot. Careful. Not settlers. James tossed the blue scarf into the snow between them. They want the women, he said. Red Hawk didn't pick it up. They'll come for them. James was silent. You could give them up, Red Hawk said. No one would blame you. I would, James replied. That night, he told the women. The older wife cried. The second one just sat, stunned. Alma stood by the door, unmoving, her back straight. They won't leave unless they get what they came for, James said. That makes this your fight too. I'll go, Alma said. Her voice was even. If it means the others stay safe. James looked at her for a long time. You really think that'd be the end of it? Her eyes didn't leave his. I don't care what happens to me. I do. The room went still. Outside, the wind picked up again, and a branch slapped the side of the house like a warning. James spent the next morning hauling firewood and checking the rifles. He laid out traps near the south tree line and repaired the shutters on the barn. He moved like a man who knew how quickly things could fall apart. Red Hawk appeared at noon, carrying dried meat and 2 extra pistols. Storm's comin', he said. And not just from the clouds. By dusk, they were ready. Or as ready as anyone could be with blood in the air. James sat on the porch cleaning his rifle while Alma braided rope with trembling fingers. The other women stayed inside. He hadn't asked them to fight. He knew they'd do what they could. Alma spoke quietly. I'm carrying his child. James looked up. The man who left you to die? She nodded once. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, that child has nothing to do with him. It's yours now. And if you want it, it's welcome here. Alma blinked. Her hand stilled. I thought you'd send me away. I buried one child, James said. I won't turn from another. The wind softened for a moment, as if holding its breath. Then came the sound of hooves. Not many, but enough. James stood. They came from the pines, 4 riders, faces cloaked in scarves, coats heavy with dust and pride. Their horses frothed at the mouth, as if they'd been pushed too hard for too long. James didn't call out. He didn't need to. The lead rider dismounted and walked forward, spurs clinking. Evenin', the man said. He had a voice that crawled across the skin, smooth, oily. We've come to collect what's ours. James didn't blink. They don't belong to you. The man smiled thinly. We buried our brother. And those women were his. His property. They're not property. That's not how the law sees it. You think I give a damn what the law says? There was silence. Then the man laughed softly. You always were too proud, James. Even when your wife died screamin'. James's jaw clenched. He didn't move. Alma stepped out from behind the door. She stood beside him. Unshaking. The man's eyes narrowed. That one was always the quiet one. Pretty, though. Bet she keeps your bed warm now, don't she? James raised his rifle. The man took a step back, hands half raised. Easy now. You wouldn't want to start a war. You came here for one. He stepped down from the porch and walked forward until he stood between the cabin and the men. Behind him, Red Hawk melted from the trees like a shadow, bow drawn. The other women watched from the windows, their faces pale but set. The leader of the riders turned to his men. We'll come back tomorrow. With more. Then he turned and rode off. James didn't move until the last hoofbeat faded. That night, the storm returned. Rain lashed the windows and turned the paths to rivers of mud. Wind slammed into the walls, shaking the shutters loose despite their efforts. But inside the cabin, something steadier took root. James sat with his rifle in his lap. Alma beside him. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes the quiet between people says more than words ever could. In the barn, the foal nickered softly in its stall. The other 2 women huddled in the kitchen, one holding a knife, the other a hammer. It wasn't much, but it was enough. James didn't sleep. Nor did Alma. They waited in the silence, side by side, for the storm that was coming. And in the quiet, beneath the thunder, something fierce began to grow. Not fear. Not dread. Resolve. Dawn arrived smeared in ash. Not the soft glow of rebirth, but a sickly gray crawling across the sky like smoke over water. The storm had broken in the night, leaving behind a world soaked in cold mud and scattered branches. The ground was thick, heavy, unwilling. James stood at the edge of the porch, boots rooted in slush, eyes trained toward the tree line where light struggled to pierce. They would come soon. The silence of the land was not peace. It was a breath held too long. Even the birds kept to their perches, hushed by the weight in the air. Alma stood behind him, her coat fastened tight, her hands tucked inside leather gloves that didn't quite fit. Her face was unreadable, but her jaw was firm. She had braided her hair back with care. Not for beauty. For war. James turned to her briefly. Stay close to the cabin. No matter what. She nodded but didn't promise. Inside, the other two women prepared the kitchen, quiet and efficient. They had soaked cloth in kerosene, sharpened knives, and laid out salt by the doors. They weren't fighters, but they wouldn't be passive either. Red Hawk returned just before sun crested the ridge. His arrival made no sound. He emerged from the fog like a warning. 6 men, he said. 2 rifles. 2 revolvers. 1 with a shotgun. 1 has a dog. James didn't ask how he knew. He simply nodded. They're not riding off this time. Red Hawk removed his coat, slung his bow over his shoulder, and stepped into place like he'd done it 100 times before. The plan was simple. Hold the cabin. Make them bleed. Let the land do the rest. James crouched behind the wagon they'd turned on its side for cover. Rain began again, soft but steady, trickling through the broken boards above. Alma stood at the window inside, watching the trail. Her hand rested on the edge of a lit lantern, its oil ready to pour. The sound of hooves came low and slow, muffled by mud. Then voices, rough, laughing without humor. James saw them first. 5 men and 1 boy, no older than 17, trailing at the rear. Faces cloaked in scarves, coats soaked through. They didn't look like justice. They looked like desperation with guns. One man stepped forward, shotgun in hand. Bring out the women, and we'll let the rest of you walk. James fired. The shot cracked the stillness, took the man in the shoulder, spun him to the ground. Chaos erupted. Gunfire rained toward the cabin. Bullets shattered window glass, tore into the wagon boards. James ducked and returned fire, calm and focused. Red Hawk loosed arrows from the tree-line, silent and precise. One struck a man in the thigh, dropping him into the mud. Inside, Alma doused the lantern flame and hurled the oil out the side window where she'd seen movement. Fire leapt across the wet ground, smoke curling thick and dark. Screams cut through the haze. One attacker tried the rear door. The younger wife slammed it shut and drove a wedge beneath it. Another man leapt the fence, only to be met with a shovel to the chest from the older wife. She shrieked as she struck again, until James called her back. Red Hawk moved like shadow, crossing behind the cabin and taking another man from behind. The dog charged him. He met it with a blade, swift and merciful. James took a bullet to the shoulder but didn't fall. He pressed a rag to the wound, teeth gritted, and kept shooting. 2 men remained. One wounded, crawling toward cover. The other, the leader, charged the porch. He barreled up the steps, screaming Alma's name like it belonged to him. She met him with the broken end of a broom handle, catching him in the gut. He doubled, cursed, grabbed her by the throat. James saw her back arch through the window. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open and tackled the man, both of them crashing to the floor. Mud smeared across the boards. Blood pooled beneath James's arm as he struggled. The man drew a knife. James slammed his hand against the floor, again, until the blade skittered away. Alma grabbed the rifle from the table, turned, aimed. She hesitated. James met her eyes. Then the man lunged, James rolled, and the rifle cracked once. The man jerked, then stilled. Alma dropped the gun. James's breath came ragged, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above. She knelt beside him, hands hovering near his shoulder. You're bleeding. He laughed, a low, broken thing. That happens in wars. The other women emerged slowly. Red Hawk stood at the edge of the field, his bow lowered, face unreadable. It was over. The cabin groaned beneath the weight of quiet. Not fear now. Relief. Later, James sat on the porch, arm bound tight, eyes scanning the empty horizon. Rain tapped softly on the roof. Alma came beside him, not speaking. She carried a cup of coffee, placed it in his good hand, and sat. The child in her belly hadn't stirred since morning, she said. She feared it might have gone quiet from the noise. He told her it would be all right. Not because he knew, but because she needed to hear it. She rested her head on his shoulder. James didn't pull away. For a long time, they sat like that, watching the wind comb through the wet grass, listening to the land breathe again. He didn't say thank you. She didn't ask for it. The world had changed. Not loudly. Not with fire and glory. But with blood in the mud, and silence shared between 2 people who had lost too much to ever speak it fully. Inside, the women cleaned the floor. Red Hawk was gone before dusk, as always. And James, once a man made of ice and stone, found himself reaching for the warmth beside him, no longer afraid of what it might melt.